Calais Campbell's made his free agency decision, and it will not be returned to the Miami Dolphins. So where does that leave the Dolphins' defensive interior? We're exploring all those options here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Cal Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. Here on the Locked On Network, today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Calais Campbell going back to where it all began, and not in college, where he played his college ball at the University of Miami, but back to Arizona, where he was originally drafted to play yet another NFL season. It was reported and announced yesterday afternoon. Campbell has agreed to terms on a contract with the Cardinals that will pay him $5 million per season with incentive dollars up to $7.5 million per season. So not aware. Miami did have a standing offer in with Calais Campbell. Where that fell on that spectrum as a competitive offer, I can't say with any level of intelligence. It's been speculated that Miami, I believe somebody that had purported to speak with Calais Campbell said something on social media over the weekend that Miami was sitting under $3 million for their offer. And I think the first thing that I would like to mention in the fallout of the Calais Campbell decision is I think Calais Campbell's earned a dollar amount and a price point in that stratosphere for his contract. And if I were the Dolphins and if I was really invested in getting Calais Campbell back, that would not have been a dollar amount that would have been considered a deal breaker for me, especially with how good he was last year and the leadership elements he brings to the team. The team ultimately, though, deciding to go in a different direction. And there's some fallout here that I think is important to note. But one thing that I think you mentioned off the start is take some consideration into the players that the Dolphins have brought in this offseason. Players the Dolphins signed from other teams. Larry Borum from Chicago, 26 years old. Zach Wilson, 26 years old. KJ Britt, 26 years old. Iafitu Melifonwu, 26 years old. Ryan Stonehouse, 26 years old. Alexander Madison, 27 years old. Willie Gay Jr., 27 years old. James Daniels, 28 years old. Nick Westbrook-Akine, 28 years old. Ashton Davis, 29 years old. Artie Burns, no guaranteed money on that contract whatsoever, not a guarantee to make the roster. 30 years old. Pharaoh Brown at tight end, guarantees of $20,000 out of a $1.355 million one-year contract. So effectively, no guarantees for Pharaoh Brown, 31 years old. There is a youth movement going on with the Miami Dolphins. The transition from Teron Armstead to Patrick Paul at left tackle, and regardless of what Teron ultimately decides to do, I'd be surprised if the Dolphins brought him back. I would. Everything that they are doing as a team that was one of the oldest rosters in football last year gives you an indication that the Dolphins are transitioning into the next nucleus of team to cycle up for their next competitive window. And that, unfortunately, does not fall in sync with what everybody perceives as to be all sunshine and rainbows, and everybody perceives that there's an urgency to win that would transcend doing the best thing both long-term and short-term for the team. The Dolphins aren't operating that way. And I think that's where there was probably some clues here for the intentions with Calais Campbell. You can look right now, and the Dolphins still, from an average age perspective, after being one of the oldest rosters in football, they still have Teron Armstead on the books, Their average age is 26.7 years old. They had double-digit draft picks. They're one draft pick away from having as many draft picks as anybody else in the class. They're this tied for the 7th youngest roster in football, and they're 0.3 years average age away from being tied for the 2nd youngest roster in football. So I'm not surprised that this didn't happen. If it were me, I personally would have said, hey, Calais, we can match the offer if you'd like to be back next year. We really value your leadership. We really value your play. We loved having you here. I'm sure all those things are true. And maybe the Dolphins tried to do that. I can't say for certain that they didn't. But I know that Calais Campbell agreed to terms to sign a contract with the Arizona Cardinals. Now, part of the motivation here is probably something to do with Miami now, with Calais Campbell's departure, on a 1-year, $5 million up to $7.5 million contract. The Dolphins are now projected to be in position to collect a 2026, not this year, not in 3 weeks, 4th round compensatory pick for the loss of Jihad Holland in free agency. Remember, compensatory picks work as a matter of net losses versus net gains amongst qualifying players. They've signed 2 qualifying free agents above the dollar amount that qualifies as compensatory gains. That's James Daniels and Zach Wilson. Those are the 2 players that the Dolphins signed. Their losses: Jihad Holland qualifies for a 4th, Calais Campbell qualifies for a 6th, and Robert Jones qualifies for a 7, meaning the Dolphins are net -1, and they will, provided everything stays the same between now and the Monday after the NFL draft, when the window closes for how they calculate compensatory gains and losses, the Dolphins are going to get a 4th round draft pick in 2026 for Jihad Holland's departure. That was not possible unless Calais Campbell signed a contract and signed it before the Monday after the NFL draft. He did that. So I would imagine the thought process for the Dolphins is, we have our price. We want to have you back, but we want to have you back at our price, and we're not going to be desperate about it, because if it doesn't work out, we ultimately know we will be getting a draft pick for a 39-year-old player who played for $2 million last year. That's a 4th round draft pick, and that's better or equal to what they were offered for Calais Campbell at the trade deadline, and they were able to keep him for the remainder of season. Now they just have to wait an extra 12 months to get the draft pick that they are indirectly getting because Calais Campbell signed, to free up Jihad Holland's departure to get the compensatory pick. So a very roundabout, sweet irony way to get there, but that's kind of how you make sense of a team that is very much in a youth movement, right? They are recalibrating, and if you want to call it a rebuild, just don't call it the kind of rebuild that we saw in 19, because that's not a standard expectation. And teams at times compete through rebuilds or retoolings or the transition into a life cycle. And I think that's where the Dolphins are at right now. They're a team that's in transition. It'll be fascinating to see what they're able to achieve this offseason amidst that infusion of all these young players. And we're going to talk a little bit about the draft here today, and we're taking a break from talking about players at certain positions that are specific targets. But we'll talk about combinations at defensive tackle, because I think that's where this realistically leaves the Dolphins now. There are some free agents of interest that are still out there on the market, but this is a very good defensive tackle class. I can't state that enough. And I think that's, if the Dolphins are going to take this position that currently has Zach Sealer, Benito Jones, and nothing else of note, you're probably going to need to add 3 names to this list, at minimum 2. One of them is probably going to need to be a veteran. So who's out there? And then if you were going to double dip in the draft, what could those combinations look like without completely compromising your outlook for the entirety of roster? We're going to get into those things next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure you guys stick with us. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy from the crowd, and witnessing unforgettable moments in person. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person, but getting tickets to the big games shouldn't be stressful. That's where Game Time comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Game Time now has the Game Time Picks, which curates a list and makes it easier to find better value for tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And with easy ticket shopping, there's amazing deals that are available for matchups coming up or for concerts coming up with the lowest price guarantee. If you find cheaper tickets in the same row and section for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So you have peace of mind before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets with the lowest prices guaranteed. So who's still out there, right? And I know this is the concern that a lot of Dolphins fans have is Calais Campbell's gone. There's some context clues that Miami wasn't really going to get super desperate with Calais Campbell in the first place. Sure enough, he goes to Arizona for a deal up to $7.5 million. Mike Clay put out a list not that long ago. I think it was at the beginning of the week. Mike Clay, senior writer for ESPN. And it was a list of the up-to-date free agency cheat sheet as far as who's available. And there are some names at interior defensive line that perks me up in my seat a little bit, seeing some of these guys out here. Now, is it a bunch of sexy names? No. Is it a bunch of guys that are at the right stage of their respective careers that would align with a youth movement in Miami? No. But it's probably good veteran insurance for the youth movement continuing with I'm assuming that there's going to be more than one defensive tackle draft based off how they have played this position. You can't just I refuse to believe that there is no plan other than, we're going to offer Calais 2 and he's going to sign back and we're going to be good. And the fact that they have handled the rest of their free agency process the last couple of weeks to target players who have not been qualifying contracts for compensatory free agents with a 4 on the line and are now in position to collect it. That tells me everything I need to know. They did this last year, and they told us last year at the end of the season. They told us that was part of the process for their free agency plan. And you cannot agree with the decision, because I don't agree with the decision. I would have paid Calais Campbell, and I would say, well, I'm just not going to get a pick. But I also, if I'm being completely fair and objective, getting indirectly a 4th-round draft pick for a 39-year-old defensive tackle who played on a 1-year, $2 million deal that you signed late in free agency last year, that's good business. If the Patriots did that with the Belichick years, or if the Chiefs did that now, or if Howie Roseman did that, or if Lesney with the Rams did that, everybody getting the 2 thumbs up, man. Good ROI there. Good return on investment for a 1-year rental on an aging player. The Dolphins just got a 4th-round pick. They'll keep it. I would imagine that they will. So don't expect any qualifying contracts. Any free agents are going to be under the $3 million per year threshold. So who does that leave you with? Well, there's some names. And again, most of these guys are veterans. John Bullard from Minnesota. John Jenkins with the Raiders. Jihad Ward with the Minnesota Vikings. William Golston with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Austin Johnson with the Buffalo Bills. None of these guys are unequivocal solutions to your problem, right? It's going to have to come through the draft unless you facilitate a trade. But these are all players that I see that are available that if you told me they played 300, 350, 400 snaps for you in a rotational role, I'd say, okay, like a valued low dollar free agency addition that you can be rest assured that they're going to execute even if they're not going to be difference makers. And I think with a lot of the rest of the front 7, with what they've done and what they have on the edge and what they've done with the linebacker room, I don't need 6 Zach Sealers in the defensive tackle room. You got a Zach Sealers. He's already the difference maker and the glue guy and the piece of the puzzle that's going to hold it together. What can you get to complement that? And I'm sure they are banking on the returned health of Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips being big-time facilitators for just as much, if not more, disruption in the defensive line group, but it coming off the edge instead of they really only had Chop Robinson as a viable threat to win off the edge last year and the back half of the back 3 quarters of the season. And Chop didn't really turn it on until halfway through. Fali Fatukasi from Houston is a player that's of interest to me. He was cut, I believe. And if that's the case, he would not count against the compensatory pick formula. And if that's the case, no, he was on a 1-year deal. Okay, so 1 year, $5.1 million deal. He was cut from Jacksonville the year prior. He played for $5.1 million last year. Was he worth that last year? Probably not. He played about 800 snaps. But that's the kind of like high floor veteran, still just turned 30 early last month. Not super aging player, but that's the kind of player that's on my radar as a free agent that's out there. Raekwon Davis is a familiar name. Would I love Raekwon Davis as a solution for you? No, but Raekwon Davis, there's familiarity. That's kind of the devil that you know. If you're looking for, again, 300 snaps, I think Raekwon Davis is a viable veteran quality depth option as long as you're not asking him to be something that he's not as a player. And he was cut from his contract with the Colts. That was a 2-year, $14 million contract. He's also just 27 years old. As far as play time last year, 538 is a rookie, 425, 585, 498, played 349 last year for the Colts, which was his lowest snap percentage. Now, if you can keep that number around 400 snaps and you're not pushing 600 snaps like we did in 2022, I'd say, okay, you can sign Raekwon Davis back. And it's a veteran answer who has a certain floor and a certain skill set that can be a sufficient depth rotational player. But you need start. You need a start. I would imagine we're probably going to look to one of those 3 picks in the first 3 rounds as a big opportunity to land a starter at defensive tackle. You don't want to just draft for need. And I would, if I had to guess right now, I would not guess that the Dolphins are going to open and shut, no questions asked, just draft Kenneth Grant at 13, the defensive tackle from Michigan, because they need a tackle. I think you're probably going to be leaving better players on the board if you just draft Kenneth Grant, regardless of what the board looks like, because you need a tackle. There are a lot of different skill sets, and I have my board up right here for defensive tackles, and we've already done a bit of a deep dive on a couple of these guys when looking at 13. We looked at Kenneth Grant, we looked at Derek Harmon from Oregon, and we looked at Walter Nolan from Mississippi. But you get into day 2, there's a lot of options. And I think even early in day 3, specifically for the nose tackle role, there's a lot of variety that you can get. And I think for the Dolphins in particular, if you go one on day 2 and one on day 3, you could come up with some pretty interesting combinations of players, depending on what you choose to do with it. So we're going to get into that next. We're going to look at some of the possible combinations that the Dolphins could come up with when you take the penetration style player, when you take a nose tackle. Do you do one early and one late? Do you do them both on the same day and both do them on day 2? Do you do them both on day 3? What could that look like? A lot of options. We're going to get into that next as we continue to discover the path at defensive tackle for the Dolphins this year, this offseason. It's coming up next. Make sure you guys stick with us. Make no mistake, I am bummed that Calais won't be back. Is very quickly ingratiated himself with Dolphins fans everywhere. Good for him, maximizing his value going out by going back out to Arizona. Wish Calais well. And I mentioned this on the show a couple weeks ago, but it had the opportunity to be a win-win scenario for Miami, because if you get him back, you get him back. If you don't get him back and he makes the decision within a certain amount of time, it does open the door for you to collect a nothing draft pick. And, it's a 2026. So for all the Chris Greer downers right now, it might be somebody else making the pick, and you might think it's a bigger deal. 12 months from now. But as I look at my board, I want to shout out the nose tackle, primary run defender type players first. Alfred Collins, Texas. Tylik Williams, Ohio State. Jamari Caldwell from Oregon. Jordan Phillips from Maryland. Not that Jordan Phillips. Relax. I would put Vernon Broughton from Texas somewhat in that category. Then you get down to the CJ Wests of the world from Indiana, the Jay Toyas from UCLA, the Nazir Stackhouses from Georgia. I mean, these guys are projected anywhere from the second round to the fifth, sixth round. And if it's just a nose tackle type player, generally speaking, those guys aren't in super high demand because you're worried about snaps opportunities. You're worried about maximizing your disruption up front. You're worried about having a personnel tell that opposing offenses can pick up on. So they don't get drafted super high. And then you have kind of these undersized penetration type players. And Walter Nolan is kind of the marquee player in that regard. And then you have TJ Sanders from South Carolina. You have Omar Norman-Lott, who had a pass rush win rate of about 20% last year. So it's a monster number rushing the passers, a transfer from Arizona State. Then you have Ty Robinson from Nebraska, and you have Aeneas Peebles from Virginia Tech. You have Howard Cross from Notre Dame, and these guys, again, are all projected to go somewhere between the second and the fifth, sixth round. And then you have kind of these universal players that do both. They defend the run. They can rush the passer with varying degrees of level of competition or ceiling in one phase or the other. But that's players like Darius Alexander from Toledo, who I think would be an awesome fit for this defense. I was down at the Senior Bowl, had a really great week, had some really positive impressions of a Darius Alexander. That's Shamar Turner from Texas A&M. That's Josh Farmer from Florida State. That's Deion Walker from Kentucky, who I'm super low on relative to consensus, but these guys are, again, all projected to go somewhere between the second and the fifth, sixth round. Like there's no shortage of names. If I looked at my board and I looked at second round just to fifth round at defensive tackle, I have 20 names in rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5. As a reminder, the Dolphins pick at 48. They pick at 98. They pick at 116. They pick at 135. They pick at 115. They pick at 155. Right? So whether that's a pick at 48 and 155, whether that's a pick at 48 or 98, whether that's a pick at 98 and 135, whether it's a pick at 116 and 135, whether it's a pick at 48 and 116, however the shakeout happens from a value perspective, they do have flexibility, even if there is existing pressure and need. And I think once you get into the middle rounds, it becomes much more generally accepted and consensus and acceptable to draft for some need, while also, targeting players that are good fits for your offense. If you were going to go early dominant run defender with a high floor, who you feel like this guy can come in and play 600 plus snaps for us on the defensive front, you can put me down for Alfred Collins. Guy's a monster against the run. He can play in the A gap. He can play nose tackle. He can bump out and play in the B gap. He can play over top of tackles. He takes double teams. He's got elite length. If you just wanted hey, let's get a guy in here who's going to play 600 plus snaps, be a run defender, can collapse the pocket, has some length to disrupt throwing windows, Alfred Collins is my guy. I love him on tape. He has teach tape run defense. And if you picked an Alfred Collins at 48, you could come back and potentially draft a Shamar Turner at 98 as a guy who's a little bit more of a well-rounded player, or a Ty Robinson at 116. Or you could potentially draft a Vernon Broughton, his teammate at Texas, at 135. Or you can go with Aeneas Peebles at 135 as an undersized pass rush specialist type of player who just doesn't have a great amount of length. Or you could go Darius Robinson and get a really complete player and then say, hey, we want another plug type player later. You could go Darius Robinson at 48 and then draft Jay Toya or Nazir Stackhouse at 155. And I think you got a nose tackle that's capable of playing 250 to 300 snaps, like what we're kind of outlining the ideal role would be for Raekwon Davis if you were going to sign. Or you can go with the pass rush specialist. If you were to skip 48, you could go with, I think, Jamari Caldwell from Oregon, who's 330 and has some surprising nimble athleticism. You could go with him or Jordan Phillips at 98 in the third round. And both of those guys are 320 plus, built low to the ground, have better athleticism than their production would suggest. And then, maybe you can move that player around or double dip and go CJ West. And then you got two guys at 315 that have good athleticism that are built low to the ground. And if you go that route, I think that would be the route where you would definitely need a veteran player if you're not going to draft a defensive tackle at 13 or 48. But there's no shortage of options where if you told me, hey, we get a Fali Fatukasi after May 1st, when it's not going to impact the compensatory formula, or you add a Raekwon Davis, or you add, Jihad Ward from Minnesota, or a William Golston from Tampa Bay, or a Brett Urban from Baltimore, who's more the end type player, or Quentin Jefferson from Buffalo, who had some good run that he had with the Jets. Any one of these names with a vet and a day 2 option and a day 3 option, or 2 day 2 options, or 2 day 3 options, they're going to have bodies. And the pass rush upside, you have to remember, is some of that's going to fall back into, where's Bradley Chubb after we didn't have Bradley Chubb for all of last year? What is Jalen Phillips? How are you going to get those 3 guys on the field at the same time? I'm not worried about pass rush in the least bit. I want stout guys that can hold the point of attack and defend the run, first and foremost on the defensive interior. And I can give you multiple names in every round from the 2nd round to the 5th round. They're going to check that box. I'm not going to tell you it's all going to work out. I'm not going to tell you it's all sunshine and rainbows, because again, if it were me, I would have just said, hey, Calais, we'll pay 6. Come play Miami. That's what I would have done. But this is the thought process why. And as long as you come away from this and you understand why Calais Campbell's not a member of the Dolphins and what the benefit is as far as what the incentive was to not match that contract offer. And again, maybe they did. I don't know. But if I were going to look at, okay, here's how you move forward from this plot on the map, that's the outline we just laid out. Hope you guys enjoyed this discussion looking at defensive tackle and the draft and free agency and Calais and him leaving and why it is not just all bad that you don't have Calais Campbell on the roster this year. But if it were me, I'd have tried my hardest. I don't know that the Dolphins financially did, but I don't know that they did. That's going to do it for us here today on the show. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys as always for checking out the show, and I'll be back to talk to you all again tomorrow.